Hi everyone, welcome to the Ideas Matter podcast, where two mates discuss philosophy, politics and intellectual history. My name is Louis.
My name's Alex.
And today we're discussing Meditations on First Philosophy by René Descartes. René Descartes.
The big boy.
Episode 2, the birthplace of modern philosophy.
Alternative title, Cartesian players.
yeah. This is a rich area for jokes, I feel. This is a very pun-worthy philosopher. So we mentioned him briefly in our last podcast, so we thought it'd be good to sort of go back in time to Descartes today. So Alex, why would we bother reading Descartes? Why bother reading a mathematician, philosopher from the 16th, 17th century?
Well, it links in pretty well to what we were talking about last week. We were talking about Charles Taylor and liberalism, and how there's this idea of the self in liberalism, that you are someone who is there is a core to your being that is necessarily separate from other people, from externalities. And the first point where that really takes hold and becomes the basis for future philosophical thought in the West is with Descartes in the Meditations.
Yeah, that's right. These sort of ideas are kicking around, and there's been a lot of great recent scholarship on this, thinking of inventing the individual, the origins of Western liberalism, where he argues that this is sort of has its roots in medieval scholasticism and then the Protestant Reformation. But then, Descartes is really where it sort of takes off and becomes mainstream.
I just want to interject here. I remember last week we were talking about liberalism very extensively, but we never actually defined it. We never actually said, oh, what is liberalism?
Yeah.
So would you like to give a little explainer of?
Sure. So liberalism is not what Americans mean by liberalism. They use liberalism to mean progressive, which historically is not necessarily that inaccurate. But liberalism is that, but it's also much broader. Liberalism is really a political philosophy that originates with, we're going to argue today Descartes, but most people would say Hobbes, and then it really sort of becomes its own in Locke. But the important thing to understand about liberalism is it's a political philosophy that says that people are individuals. Yeah. The fundamental social unit is individuals. It's not nations, it's not communities, it's not families. People are first and foremost individuals. Yeah. And so the follow-on point from that is that individuals have what Locke called natural rights. We don't use the term natural right today because it's infused with a lot of religious thinking. But you can see how that sort of gets taken for granted in today's politics, that people are individuals who have individual rights. That was, a intellectual development in the history of Western philosophy, and it sort of behooves us, I think, to recognize that and to not talk about these things as if they've always existed. Because when you interact with other cultures, I'm interested in Confucianism and Chinese culture, and I think the best way to understand liberalism is maybe to contrast it with something like Confucianism, where liberalism says people are individuals and stresses people's rights. Confucianism really stresses community and family and stresses people's duties rather than rights, duties that you have to other people rather than what is owed to you by others, as what liberalism says.
Yeah, no, for sure. In Western nations, it really is taken for granted as a reality, but rather we should see it as sort of a focal point of a way of thinking about society, a way of thinking about politics. And that this was not always a given, and it's still not really a given, because you go to any culture where liberalism wasn't or hasn't been a historical force, say China or, the Indian subcontinent up until pretty recently, and you have a much more different orientation of the self towards others, towards communities, where it's a lot more... There's less of a hard boundary.
Yeah, less of a hard boundary is a good way to put it. It's often hard for... this is why we were talking about last week about sort of Taylor's criticism of liberalism, and why he feels that it can become selfish because it doesn't have anything to say about your obligations to others.
Yeah.
And that is by design because others are not really relevant to your own development according to the liberal idea of individual selfhood.
Yeah, and we'll see that going forward in this discussion of Descartes, how he never actually talks about anyone else ever. His conception of how we can know who we are, know ourselves, how we can know knowledge of the world from that is purely in relation to what you individually can think and perceive. There's no sort of reference at all to any other people at all, to any social context, cultural context, historical context. And, well, that's been pretty influential going forward.
Absolutely. It's been hugely influential, as we'll explain more towards the end of the podcast after we explain his argument more properly. But yeah, that's exactly why it's important. But I think we should say a few words about the historical context because obviously it doesn't just fall out of the sky. He's responding to a lot of social trends that are going on at the time. One of them is the Protestant Reformation.
Yeah.
And the Catholic Counter-Reformation, which, in all honesty, I didn't know was a thing until I read the Penguin Introduction to Meditations, and they were talking about the Catholic Counter-Reformation. But I feel like, Alex, you know, you'd probably better explain the Protestant Reformation than I could.
Look, I think you're a little too confident in that, but I'll give it a go. Well, pretty much the Protestant Reformation was a schism in Christianity in Europe that occurred around, when was it, like the 1600s, around that time. There was a big figure, Martin Luther, who was a German theologian, who famously put up this list of 99 theses on the Brandenburg Cathedral? I could be getting that wrong. It's somewhere in Germany. Where he lists a bunch of points where he thinks that the doctrine of the Catholic Church is at odds with Scripture, you know, the actual commandments of the Bible. And this got a bit out of hand. And next thing you know, there has been a massive schism, not just along religious, but also along political lines in Europe. You see a lot of northwestern European, well, would have been kingdoms at the time, and empires being caught up in Protestantism. They really get convinced of the doctrine, and then a large series of wars occurs between Protestantism and Catholicism, which was up until then the major religious power, but also the Catholic Church was in itself a very powerful geopolitical player in Europe. So, you know, it is primarily a religious difference, but there was quite a bit of actual politicking between states involved there.
I think, it obviously starts with Martin Luther and genuine theological and spiritual gripes with what's going on with the Catholic Church. Because its sort of power was unchallenged. I mean, there weren't any other churches at this time. I mean, there were outside of Christendom, obviously, but there weren't any other like strictly Christian churches. So it obviously starts with a genuine theological dispute. But then, as you said, I mean, it was highly convenient for a lot of kings who didn't like the fact that the Catholic Church had all this power. You know, they wanted to be purely sovereign. I mean, England is a great example of this, and that's eventually how you get the Anglican Church. But what's important for our discussion today is that Catholicism, and this was one of the main critiques of Protestants, was that Catholicism, correct me if I'm wrong, Alex, because I'm not religious, but sermons were given in Latin.
Yeah.
So obviously your average day person was not capable of really understanding Scripture and understanding the Bible in their own right.
Yeah. So the average person's access to Scripture would have to, it's necessarily through the clergy.
Yeah.
You would have to have a priest explain it to you rather than you read it directly.
Exactly. So interpretations of the Bible are sort of the exclusive domain of the Catholic Church and their sort of hierarchy. And Protestants have a problem with that because, as you said, Martin Luther thinks that they've erred on that. They've made some misinterpretations. But that really becomes this really important idea that then Descartes' responding to, that you don't need someone else to interpret the Bible for you.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone has their own personal access to God if they're sufficiently, devout, and they can actually not interpret, but they don't need to rely on someone else to interpret it for them.
Yeah.
And you start having sermons and church services not in Latin. So it really expands the scope of religious interpretation, which is a threat to the power of the Catholic Church. And there is a good point that is made in the introduction to this book where, the Catholic Church says, well, our power, our legitimacy derives from these holy texts and our interpretation of them. But then the question becomes, well, what makes them holy? Do the scriptures give legitimacy to the Catholic Church, or does the Catholic Church give legitimacy to the scriptures? It sort of becomes circular reasoning. And so the Catholic Counter-Reformation is trying to prove that these interpretations that the Catholics have come up with can actually be proved rationally. You don't need to rely on faith to prove them. They want to sort of reason your way into them. They want to avoid this charge of circular reasoning.
Yeah. And it should also be mentioned here that the Protestant Reformation and the Catholic Counter-Reformation to it really lit a fire underneath intellectuals in Europe at the time. To the point that this Reformation and Counter-Reformation fueled the Enlightenment.
Yeah, and that really sort of gets to another trend that's going on at the time, is sort of the beginnings of the scientific revolution, which, as you're alluding to, makes people start to question, well, how do we actually know all this stuff?
Yeah.
If faith has its weaknesses, how do we actually know what we know about the world is true? Can't we just be mistaken? And you get a resurgence in skepticism, which actually is an ancient Greek philosophy, and there's different forms of it, but the form that is most relevant to Descartes is I'm going to probably mispronounce this, Pyrrhonism, which is a less dogmatic form of skepticism, which doesn't say we can't know anything, because that's contradictory. You know that you know nothing. That's a knowledge claim. But Pyrrhonism simply says that everything that we know, or we think we know, is subject to doubt.
Yeah.
You can't act with certainty. And that really gets picked up by Descartes. And so the whole point of this text, of the Meditations on First Philosophy, is to answer the skeptic charge, but also to assist the Catholic Church by proving, in his words, that God exists and that the human soul is immortal.
Yeah.
Descartes wants to prove those things without appealing to faith or without appealing to a religious text.
Yeah. It's worth reading out the actual full title of the text here, which is Meditations on First Philosophy, in which the existence of God and the distinction between the soul and the body are demonstrated. So from the outset, we can see that there's something he's trying to get at solidly with this method of doubt that he's using in this text here. Like he has an end point in mind that he wants to reach, and that's we can get into this as we start to discuss the Meditations, but that's a big criticism of his argument.
It's good to flag that from the start, because you're right. He is going into it with motivated reasoning, and he admits that. People pointed that out to him, and I'm trying to find the exact quote. I don't think I can find it, but he says, well, look, I never went into this trying to teach skepticism. I went into it trying to disprove skepticism, which seems like an odd admission if his whole project is radical doubt. He wants to doubt everything that we know. But you're not really doing that if you're going into this project with your sort of desired outcome.
Yeah, it's a pretty bad move. But he really wants to find just like some basis, some foundation on which we can build all knowledge. And it seems like he already had this idea that, well, that basis is God, so how can I go about doing that? If you have the full text of the Meditations, it actually opens up with a letter of dedication to the theologians of the Catholic Church at at the Sorbonne in Paris, where he says outright, I've always thought that two issues, namely God and the soul, are chief among those that ought to be demonstrated with the aid of philosophy rather than theology.
Yeah, great quote. And another one I wrote down from that same letter is he says, everything that can be known about God can be shown from reasons that derive from no other source but our own mind. And he has what I think is actually a pretty good reason for that claim. He says, we're born humans, we're not born Christians. So why would God make the Christian faith or faith in God impossible to get into or contra to the reason which he gave humans? He wouldn't make it inaccessible. He wouldn't want us to engage in circular reasoning. And you hear that today as, you know, when people make criticisms against religion, people say, well, you know, God gave us reason with the intention of using it. Reason and rationality aren't antithetical to faith. And a lot of this goes back to Descartes. So this is a really, really seminal text, but actually its consequences end up going beyond his immediate religious concerns, which we'll see once we start getting into the first meditation and the second meditation. So I'll just briefly sketch out what he's doing in these first meditations. So he embarks on this project of radical doubt because he wants to knock down everything that he thinks he believes. And the reason he's doing that is because he wants to find that which is certain, and then he can build back up from there. So the first meditation is him sort of justifying why we should engage in radical doubt, which again, as I've said, is suspect because he's doing it for motivated reasons, but now he's going to try and give us rational reasons about why we should engage in radical doubt. So he points out by saying, our senses deceive us. And this is where like the historical context becomes obvious, because if you've got the sort of the emergence of new scientific ways of thinking, I mean, he's writing around the same time that Galileo was condemned by the Catholic Church. So that's the historical context. But people sort of are becoming aware that the way that they immediately perceive the world doesn't actually track onto reality as often as they've thought. So Descartes says, well, our senses often deceive us. That's true. And he says, we should never trust anyone who's deceived us, even if only once. So if you've ever been mistaken about something that you've sensed, you saw something and it turned out to be an illusion, you can't trust your senses. Then he says, well, how do we know we're not awake? How do you know we're not asleep? We could be dreaming right now, and this could not be real. Personally, I've never found that reason for doubt very compelling, because I've never had a dream so vivid I thought it was real life.
Yeah, I'm at two minds about that one. You know, he pretty much says, well, dreams feel lifelike in the moment, even though there's no connection between what we're doing in our dream and what we're actually doing, which is, you know, sleeping in a bed, hopefully.
Yeah.
So from there's cause to doubt the sensory experience of our waking life. And on the one hand, I've had dreams that were just so mundane and boring that I wake up and I couldn't distinguish it from a memory. Like I'm just working a retail job and there's nothing that really happens.
Yeah.
But also there are times where you're in a dream and you can tell you're in a dream, which incredibly coincidentally happened to me last night. I was having a dream that I was trying to read something.
Yeah.
And you notice this when you're reading something in a dream, the text changes. You know, the words, the letters on the page, whatever you're reading, they shift around and they're not constant. You know, you look at it for 1 second, you look away and you come back and there's a different thing written there. So you kind of can tell you're in a dream, but we can, you know, to be a bit, you know, a little charitable to him, give it a modern spin, we could kind of compare this to, say, like The Matrix.
That's true. I mean, sort of like The Matrix really is like the modern version of Descartes' radical doubt. That's a good point. But he says, yeah, okay, let's just assume that we are asleep right now, because we don't know whether we're awake or asleep. But then he says, okay, well, even if we're asleep right now, the images that we have when we're dreaming, we don't just totally make them up. You know, they come from an experience outside of us. The images in our mind come from somewhere. And he gives the example of a painter or an artist who makes new things by composite images. They sort of, their originality is by combining different things. So even if we're mistaken in our dreams, even if we dream of something that doesn't look like it does in reality, the idea comes from somewhere else. And so this leads him on to quite an important point where he says that we can be mistaken about the sort of precise nature of things, but we can't be mistaken about things that are purely general, like size, quantity, extension, which is a bit of a weird term that doesn't really get used anymore. But this is really the idea of primary qualities. That there are certain things that exist completely independent of our mind, like the size of something or the shape of something. And even if we're mistaken about their appearance, so their color or their scent, those secondary qualities ultimately derive from their primary qualities. And these primary qualities must exist, because how else could we have some idea of them?
Yeah.
But then he goes on to dispute that. He says, okay, well, like 2 plus 3 equals 5. That can't be false, even if the world is something other than I thought it was, because just by definition, it's true.
Yeah, you have 2 things and you have 3 more things and you count them all up and then you have 5.
Yeah, I mean, on its own terms, it's true. But then he goes, okay, well, what if we're being deceived into thinking that's true? What if there's like an evil demon or God is deceiving us? So we can't even hold on to that. So he's really just stripping back everything.
Yeah. This is where there's a really strong matrix parallel. So in my text, it's translated as there's an evil genius, but I've also heard malicious demon, which I think is way cooler. In other translations, there's a supremely powerful and clever being who has directed his entire effort in deceiving me. So everything you perceive, like the world around you, your body, your senses, is in fact an illusion conjured up by this evil genius.
Yeah, exactly. Towards the end of the meditation, he's like, all right, well, I have no senses at all, no body, no eyes, no ears. And then he goes, wow, that was pretty intense. I'm going to go to bed now. Because he's literally just writing by the fire in his diary. And he's
I'm tired, I got a head.
I think he says, like, I'm pretty lazy, and it's like it's hard to hold on to these thoughts, so I'm just going to go to bed and like get back to this tomorrow.
Oh, look, I just have to pinch in, interrupt the meditations here. This dude loves sleeping so much. Like he died because, he was always kind of a late riser. He worked on his own terms, just doing like mathematical work. You don't really have to get up and go to an office or something when you're a 1600s mathematician from a wealthy family.
Yeah, the triangles will still be there when you get home.
Yeah, but he then got a job, directly before the end of his life, tutoring the Princess of Sweden.
Yeah.
And to do that, he had to actually wake up early. And the traveling to Sweden, the difference in the climate and just like the shock of having to wake up early just was such a shock to his immune system that he just carked it.
He literally died.
Yeah, that's how he died.
Yeah.
So safe to say he takes his sleep seriously.
Yeah. He was, looking after his health when he decided to stop doubting and go to bed early. I mean, that sounds like we're exaggerating, but like there's a timeline at the start of this book where it explains his life, and it's literally, I think, less than a year from when he gets that job to when he dies.
Mm-hmm.
Like he doesn't hold. 11th of February 1950, dies at Stockholm.
1950.
Sorry, 1650. Force of habit. 1650, 11th of February, he dies at Stockholm. He arrived in Stockholm in October of 1649. So less than 6 months. He didn't even make it less than 6 months into waking up early before he died.
That's relatable.
Yeah, that is very, very relatable. Okay, so now he wakes up the next day and he's like, well, that was pretty intense. He wakes up, but he goes, oh, well, I don't have a body. I don't have any sensory existence. So then he asks, well, does that mean I don't exist? He says, quote, am I so tied to a body and senses that I cannot exist without them? And this is where he's going to start sounding familiar to a lot of you. He goes, well, no, because as long as I think, I am something.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a thinking thing. Otherwise, who is it that's doing this radical doubt? He says, I quote, I am, I exist. That is certain. And he says in a later text, he actually doesn't say it in this one, but the famous quote, I think, therefore I am.
Mm-hmm. So like the very fact of your thought is what proves your existence.
Exactly. And then he says something further which I find really, really interesting. He goes, okay, I exist. I'm a thinking thing. I can't be mistaken about my thought. And then he makes a move that I think is really interesting where he goes, okay, well, we seem to be having these sensory experiences of things that we think are outside our mind. Now, we might be mistaken about their nature or whether they exist or not. But we're not mistaken about the fact that we appear to be perceiving them.
Yeah.
And this really is crucial to me because it's this fundamental dualism, this distinction in Western philosophy that goes back to Plato that we've never been able to get rid of. And you can really split reality in two. There's the world of appearances, and that's the world that we interact with. And then there's the world of things in themselves. And we are condemned to exist in the world of appearances, or the way things seem to be. So it's often called seeming versus being. Things seem to be a certain way, but the way they actually are, their true being, is distinct from that. And I guess it's often said that all Western philosophy is a footnote to Plato, and I don't think that's an exaggeration because we've never really gotten around that problem.
Yeah, that's been a constant ever since Plato first wrote it down and through to most of the major philosophers of the West, even to the modern day, still grappling with that.
Exactly. And really what's quite distinctive about Western philosophy is that there's this desire that what makes humans special, what makes humans unique, is that we can, or some philosophers will say we can. Plato said we can transcend the realm of appearances and perceive things in themselves by using the faculty of reason. Because reason is what sets us apart from animals, and if you're writing a millennia later, reason is what God gave us, so it must be able to transcend the world of appearances because it's God-given. But I just wanted to flag that because it's an interesting example of how what might seem to be an unproblematic assumption is actually grounded in like millennia of thought.
Yeah. He makes it seem very natural, and through his argument, it does seem just like a very reasonable next step. But that step happens within a very long-standing historical context.
Yeah, exactly. But the most important thing about this meditation, and we'll return to that later, is that the mind and the body are completely distinct.
Yeah.
You can't be certain about your body, but you can be certain about your mind, which has an interesting conclusion, is that it would seem to be that you can exist without your body, but you can't exist without your mind. So when I say mind, I mean thoughts. But when I say body, I would include in that the brain.
Yeah.
Because the brain is a physical thing. But he says, no, the mind is distinct from that, and we might actually be a computer software.
Yeah.
Or our brain might be in a vat. We might be in the matrix. So we can exist without our body, but we can't exist without our mind. So they must be two very distinct things, and that is the mind-body problem.
Yeah.
Or sorry, no, the mind-body problem is if the mind is immaterial and infinite. Sorry, it's not infinite, but it's not like confined to like physical shape, physical form. How can it interact with the body, which is material? That's the mind-body problem.
Yeah. And it's safe to say that really shook things up, and it's probably one of the biggest areas of contemporary philosophy.
Oh, yeah.
Trying to square that circle.
Yeah, I mean, it's. I did a whole subject on philosophy of mind, and people are still grappling with this. It's like, well, if you assume that the mind is immaterial, and I think there are good reasons to not dismiss that idea, not be a pure physicalist, then you have to say, well, how on earth is it that A, the universe could contain something that's immaterial and seemingly not reducible to modern science, and B, how could that interact with our physical world? And obviously, this is easy to answer if you're religious, because you can just say, well, God helps it.
Yeah.
He intervenes and makes it so. But the third meditation, he starts talking explicitly about the existence of God, and this is where, in my mind, his sort of philosophical genius starts to wane.
Yeah. Here's the title, the subtitle to Meditation 3, Concerning God, That He Exists.
Yeah.
So he's really, really setting out what he thinks there.
You could say he's putting the horse before Descartes.
Oh, that's beautiful. There's a soundboard here, and I wish I knew which one was the
Yeah.
But I don't know, maybe I'll press something else. There's like a weird sci-fi noise one.
We just lost half of our listeners. Sorry. But in the third meditation, he goes, okay, well, back when I thought I knew stuff, when I thought I knew that the world exists, what exactly was it that I was so sure about? And he says, it was the ideas of things in my mind. It was the mental images that I have of things. So he says that the term idea refers exclusively to mental images. So when I say idea, I'm just talking about like an image in my mind. But then we have other kinds of thoughts as well. We have what he calls judgments. That's when we think something about what we're perceiving.
Yeah.
So an emotion or a volition or a judgment. And he goes, well, that's where we err, because we can't be mistaken that we're having this experience, but we can be mistaken in making a judgment about that experience, i.e. that experience represents an external reality.
Mm.
But then he gets around it by using this technical, scholastic, philosophical term by saying, okay, well, ideas which represent substances, and a substance, again, is sort of like what I said before about a primary quality, that which all other attributes and secondary qualities derive from. Ideas which represent substances contain more intentional reality than those which represent modes. So, I don't know, let's think about, like, how would you put this in terms that Descartes would agree with?
Well, he gives this example here of having two different ideas of the sun.
Yeah.
You know, you look at the sun and you'd say you had no idea at all about like the science of astronomical data of what the sun actually is. You just see it and you think it's a thing in the sky, and it's, you know, it's relatively small compared to the rest of the sky. You know, it doesn't completely cover the sky, therefore this thing isn't very large. But there's actually, that's our sensory idea of what it is, but we have a reasoned idea that it is an astronomical object many times larger than the Earth. You know, we know the reasoned idea to be true. Therefore, your immediate idea of the sun, derived from your sensory experience, is the least accurate, and there is a higher, more accurate idea.
Yes. Yes. The faculty of understanding, which is God-given, as he later explains. So therefore, it can't be wrong.
Yeah.
And when we are wrong, we're not actually using our faculty of understanding. You see how he starts to like wriggle out of these like skeptical problems by just sort of saying, if I establish the existence of God, then I can wriggle out of all these other problems by being like, no. Understanding is God-given. God's perfect. Therefore, I can't be mistaken. And when I am mistaken, I'm just like not using that faculty properly, or I'm using some other faculty that isn't God-given. It's more human.
Yeah.
But God exists because we have ideas that contain intentional reality. And intentional reality is just when your ideas refer to something else. And he goes, okay, ideas which represent infinite substances, such as God, contain more intentional reality than those which represent finite substances. So when I'm thinking about God, that contains more intentional reality than when I'm thinking about a table. Now, he presents that as if it's like totally unproblematic, but obviously to today's listeners, that doesn't necessarily seem like a totally reasonable assumption.
Yeah. So like pretty much his idea is that like ideas proceed from other ideas.
Yes.
It's almost like there's a chain of degrading quality from the highest point.
Yes.
So unless we can think of this chain as going on for a long, long, long time of gradually more and more degradation towards imperfection, unless we have some like first idea from which all the other less good ideas follow. So if there are qualitative differences in the accuracy or the perfection of your ideas, say how we perceive the sun and what we actually know the sun to be, and your ideas from sense experience tend to be of the lower sort, and we get higher and a little more accurate ideas when we go to reasoned notions of the mind, then we can know God exists as he's the highest sort of idea we can conceive. You know, in his words, eternal, infinite, omniscient, omnipotent, and creator of all things other than himself.
Yeah, exactly. Once he sort of establishes God, he sort of runs away with the idea.
Yeah. It's like he finishes up a really annoying chore, but doesn't do a good job of it. But he's like, all right, I'm just not going to think about that anymore. We're running away. It's like,
Yeah. look, I want to be charitable here and then sort of express his reasoning as best I can, and it goes back to what you were saying about being a chain of ideas.
Yeah.
Now, philosophers hate the idea of what's called an infinite regress,
Mm-hmm.
and that's when you just keep appealing to something else that caused something.
Yeah.
Well, this idea was caused by this idea, and that idea was caused by a previous idea.
And so on forever.
So on forever. They want the buck to stop somewhere. There's this great anecdote, I think it's in the introduction to Stephen Hawking's A Brief History of Time, and he gives this lecture about the Big Bang, and this person allegedly gets up and says, "You're mistaken. The universe is actually on the back of a turtle." And Stephen Hawking goes, "Okay, sure. What's the turtle sitting on?" And the guy goes, "Well, it's sitting on another turtle." He goes, "Well, what's that turtle sitting on?" And the guy goes, "It's turtles all the way down." And that's sort of that's become a classic example of an infinite regress.
Yeah.
And you can think of it like, well, if God doesn't exist and the Big Bang happened instead, what caused the Big Bang?
Yeah.
Like, logically to us, we want the buck to stop somewhere. So we have all these ideas which are imperfect because we keep making all these mistakes. They must have come from somewhere, some sort of uncaused cause, to use the religious phrase. And the idea of God to Descartes is perfect. God is this perfect being, but we are imperfect. So a perfect idea couldn't be caused by an imperfect idea, right? So it must have come from something perfect.
Yeah.
Furthermore, God can't be a deceiver because to deceive is to be bad or to be wrong, and that's a defect. Again, this is very ancient Greek where they sort of say that truth and goodness are one and the same thing.
Yeah.
And so if you say God's not a deceiver because God's perfect, well, that assumes that being moral and being true are one and the same. But we must have this idea of a perfect God that precedes ourselves, because otherwise how could we recognize our own imperfection unless we had a benchmark of perfection against which to compare it?
Yeah.
Now, I don't find that argument very compelling, but
You can see his reasoning.
I can see his reasoning.
He's like, well, since I'm not perfect and I can think of something more perfect than I am, something outside of my mind has to exist. And because ideas degrade along this chain, that thing that exists has to be the most perfect sort of thing. So that must be God.
Yeah, absolutely. Did you want to talk about the fourth meditation before we get into like the self and stuff like that?
Yeah. Well, I really didn't have all too much to say about this. I just have a couple notes here where he's sort of just going on along from that basis that he just established there. He goes, well, we've doubted everything and we found out that I exist because there has to be something to think. And then we get into this whole thing of, well, there's different sorts of ideas and perceptions and they go along this chain and I can think of something more perfect than I, so therefore there has to be something, and that something is God. So it's like, all right, if all I know to be true is God and myself, and God is good and wouldn't deceive me, how does falsity exist?
Yeah.
How are there things that are false if all I know there to be are myself and God who's good and wouldn't deceive me? Well, he tries to get around this by saying, well, there's this great chain, like we were talking about. Things exist essentially on a scale from God, which is absolute perfection and goodness, to nothingness, which is absolute imperfection, and he calls it evil as well. So like you said, there's this real dualistic ancient Greek idea. Ignorance is bad, knowledge is good. So he says humans exist between the 2 points and perceive falsity due to this distance from God and proximity to nothingness. He has this quote here. In itself, error is a lack rather than a real thing dependent on God. So when we're incorrect about our perceptions, about our ideas, that is simply us moving away from God. That is the absence of God from our ideas.
Yeah, absolutely. So at the start of the fourth meditation, which is called
Concerning the True and the False.
Oh, really? My translation just says truth and falsehood, but I prefer your translation. But he says on the first page of that, the faculty of judgment which, just like everything else that is in me, I received from God. Since God does not wish me to be mistaken, he obviously did not give me a faculty such that when I use it correctly, and that's the key caveat, I could ever be mistaken. So as long as we're using what God gave us properly, we can't really be mistaken about the world. And he says later, it is undoubtedly an imperfection in me that I do not use this freedom well, and that I make judgments about things that I do not understand correctly. Which, like, to me just feels like a semantic argument, because the question is, well, how can you know? How can you ever understand anything? And then we can doubt that by saying, look at all these flaws in our understanding.
Yeah.
And Descartes says, well, that's just not real understanding. It's sort of like the no true Scotsman fallacy.
Yeah, he's always kind of evading the question at this point.
Yeah. But the first two meditations, particularly, like, I think therefore I am, my mind is distinct from my body. I mean, that's like really long-lasting seminal philosophy.
Yeah, that's where the meat of it is till this day.
Absolutely. People don't really, I mean, every philosophy student has had meditations assigned to them, but it would be the first two or the first three.
Yeah.
It wouldn't be the last three where he's just talking about God.
The way I've seen it is you get meditation 1, meditation 2, and then it skips to 6.
Yeah, because 6 is where he talks about, like, material things and how can I be sure that they exist. But he says something really, really interesting in the 4th meditation, which again speaks to the long-lasting effect of Descartes. He says, I think there is no role in physics, which he's just using to refer to all natural science, for that whole class of causes which are usually sought in purposes, because I think that I cannot investigate God's purpose without temerity. So what he's referring to here is Aristotle famously had 4 different causes. And the final cause, the 4th cause, is, I guess, why something happened. So, for example, if we talk about this table, its efficient cause, or its material cause, is what it's made of. Its efficient cause is like the person who made it, but its final cause is its purpose. It exists for me to put my laptop on it, or for people to use it as like a workstation. That's its teleology, its purpose. And that used to be very much part of, like, we wouldn't want to call it scientific thinking today, but that was questions that people asked about things. What is its purpose? And with this quote here, Descartes really says, well, there's no role in science for those kind of questions. Science should just ask how things happened, but they shouldn't ask why they happened. And that, despite all the theological reasoning in here, is really the birth of modern science.
Yeah, he really just slips that in there. Like, if you were skim reading it, you probably wouldn't even notice it.
Yeah, but I was like, wow, I mean, that's really, really important. Because, again, it's something today that we just take for granted.
Yeah.
But at the time when he wrote that,
it's probably a pretty controversial idea.
Exactly, because philosophy and science were the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, science was just called natural philosophy.
Yeah, precisely. So they're only just starting to break apart now at the time Descartes is writing. Look, the 6th meditation, my brain just sort of buckled by this point.
Yeah, my brain really started to lose steam around meditation 4.
Yeah, all this God talk.
Yeah, honestly, listeners, you're not missing too much.
Yeah.
There's not too much meat on the bone beyond this point.
Yeah, precisely. I mean, once you sort of get the idea that, like, he thinks it's certain that God exists and that God's not going to deceive you about the world, provided that you're using the faculty he gave you properly, then you can sort of meet the skeptical charge with some degree of confidence. But I think with that, we should really talk about the political consequences of Descartes and his conception of the self, because we've spoken about the philosophical and scientific consequences, but what are the political consequences of that?
We always like to tie things into how things are today and why they're impactful. Well, the big important part of the meditations for politics today is in his idea of the self. Like we were talking earlier in the intro, the liberal self, that you are fundamentally an individual that is separated from everyone else. And we can see this in the meditations here. He says, well, I have all reason to doubt everything outside of me except for the fact that I think. So there is a core to me that exists and is true and is independent of any externality. Anything about my external environment, any teaching I've had, any acculturation I've had, any experiences I've had from my friends and family or what have you, that is ultimately sort of incidental to my true being, my true self, which exists apart from all of that.
Yeah, exactly. Your essence, what it is to be Alex, or this thinking thing that calls itself Alex, is completely untouched by all these external obligations. And if you think that that's not an idea that's powerful today, then think about, I mean, this is going to sound controversial, but think about the concept of transgenderism. If I am not my physical body, if I could be something other than my physical body, then of course my gender could be distinct from my sex.
Yeah.
Right? Now, this is not to comment on transgenderism as an issue, but only to say that, like, the philosophical worldview that makes thinking in that way possible comes from Descartes.
Yeah.
You can be something other than your biology.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think you were just telling me you've written something that really touches on this.
Yeah, when I was first sort of beginning to understand these ideas and how all contingent the idea of the self was dependent on Descartes, I managed to slip this into an essay I wrote for a subject called Asia and the World. So you'd think it has nothing to do with with Descartes, but I managed to get it in there because we had to reflect on authoritarianism and democracy in Asia, and it was sort of this debate that went on in the 90s called Asian values. You know, is liberalism necessarily Western? And I said yes, because I wrote that liberalism, as we've been speaking about, relies upon the Cartesian subject. Descartes said, I think, therefore I am. And the self is distinct from its external properties, which means, therefore, I'm not defined by my societal, cultural, or biological obligations, which means I'm free to define myself however I want. And this liberal understanding of the self, as the self being distinct from everything else, is what makes it a universal ideology.
Yeah.
It's what makes us Westerners so confident that we can go around the world and say, no, all this talk about liberalism, all this talk about rights, it's not contingent. These are universal ideas because our understanding of the self is by definition universal. The self owes nothing to cultural history, to societal context. The self is completely distinct and prior to all of that.
Yeah.
And if you go into another culture, you know, Westerners so often want to just sort of remove all this cultural baggage and impose this way of thinking on them without actually realizing that this view itself is culturally contingent.
Yeah, for sure. It's a way for, well, it gets used in a way for Westerners to completely cut off any sort of historical or cultural context and shove their values in everywhere.
Yeah, I mean, I said that, like, the cogito, because the Latin is cogito ergo sum, the cogito is I think, or the I. You could think of the cogito as a secularized version of the Christian soul.
Yeah.
So everyone has within them this thing that thinks.
Yeah.
Sounds very similar to the idea of a soul.
Yeah, no, it really does. We can see that Descartes here really is the stepping point between this Christian understanding of a soul that's, you know, theologically contingent, and he rationalizes it. He philosophizes it rather than using theology.
As was his aim.
Yeah, like as I read out this quote from his letter of dedication, always thought that two issues, namely God and the soul, are chief among those that ought to be demonstrated with the aid of philosophy rather than theology. And it's a hop, skip, and a step from soul to self.
Absolutely.
You just take out the God and there you go.
And look, I don't mean to sound like I think this is all horrible, like I'm criticizing all of this. Obviously, there's a lot that's good about understanding the self in this way, because if the self is distinct from your biology, then you should treat people as selves and not treat them as a woman or a man, or treat them by reference to their societal status or their ethnicity. Like, there's very, very good consequences that come out of this idea. And again, as I just mentioned before, the idea of transgenderism, the idea that you can be something other than what you outwardly present. There are good political, byproducts of this idea, and pointing out that it's contingent and abstract doesn't necessarily mean that we should throw it out. But I point it out to say that because it's contingent, we shouldn't treat it as like a universal law, and we shouldn't be entirely uncritical of it. And this is where I feel like this really links back to what we were talking about last week, and the atomized self, and how we're losing our sense of community. And this idea of the self really ties into that.
Yeah, 100%. Like, we can see with this idea of that you have this self that is fundamentally separate from any externalities. Over time, that can really develop into a deep sense of alienation.
Yeah.
Well, if I'm fundamentally distinct and separate from all other things, then how do I find belonging? How do I orient myself in a world where everybody else is just this atomized individual?
Yeah. I mean, this gets picked up. I mean, it does get picked up by Hobbes, because aren't they contemporaries of each other, Hobbes and Descartes?
Yeah. Hobbes actually wrote an objection to the Descartes' Meditations.
Did he?
Yeah, and it's if you get a copy of it today, it's published alongside the Meditations, so you'll be able to read what Hobbes had to say about it.
Yeah.
But anyways.
But look, Hobbes is obviously talking about people in a state of nature as being individuals, and you only enter into relationships or contracts with them to gain some sort of utility.
Yeah.
Which makes sense if you take Descartes. Why do I keep fucking up his name like that? Descartes. Descartes. Which makes sense if you take Descartes' version of the self seriously, because you have no other obligation or connection to people.
Yeah.
Seemingly you would only interact with them if you feel like you can get some sort of benefit from it.
Yeah, it just leads to a completely contractual understanding, a completely instrumental understanding of how people relate to one another. Connection isn't valuable in and of itself. It's valuable because you can get something out of it that is of benefit to you as an individual.
And that's the entire premise for the liberal understanding of the state. The state exists to mediate between contracts.
Yeah.
Contracts that exist between isolated individuals who've entered into some sort of arrangement to gain some sort of utility.
Yeah. And I think that's part of what, when you see the emergence of liberalism historically in Europe, especially around, the Industrial Revolution in Britain and the French Revolution, the political revolution in France, a lot of the people who were pushing liberalism were lawyers. A lot of the Jacobins, which was the radical faction of the revolution in France, were lawyers. It's as if this contractual understanding of how people relate to one another just seeped into society. It's been constructed into society just as a natural way of how we view the world.
Yeah, absolutely.
And interact with one another.
Absolutely. And I don't want to be the kind of podcast that just name drops other books at the expense of actually explaining the ideas. But Why Liberalism Failed by Patrick Deanan. Anyone who knows me has probably had that book recommended to them.
It's really good.
It's a good book, although at times it does kind of sound like a less of a cultural critique, more of a cultural whining. It's like, why can't people see how bad everything is? And this is all liberalism's fault. But the good thing about the book is he's using liberalism in its correct sense. And he gives this fantastic example where he talks about the rise of casual work. And if you think of liberalism as people, as individuals, rational, formally equal, which again is another criticism of liberalism, that's a whole other can of worms, but they're formally equal, and they engage in this employment relationship, right? Now, it would seem to be liberalism par excellence to have a casual work contract that is very easy for both parties to exit it as soon as either one of them feels like they're not getting utility from it. Because we're just individuals who owe no obligations to things around us, no external obligations, certainly not to our employers or our employees. And so we engage in these casual contracts, and it's very easy to exit them. And you see how this becomes manifest in the culture today, where flexibility and reinventing yourself and having a personal brand is venerated. It's like seen as the best thing ever because, of course, we're all just these abstract individuals who want to sell ourselves and be flexible and not be defined, not be tied down.
Rise and grind, bro.
Rise and grind. Why don't you just start a podcast? But I think really that gets to the point of why we started this though. Is because a lot of people will say, well, why did you study philosophy? What a pointless degree. Because people say that, and then they'll go about their lives making claims and making assumptions that they think are totally objective, without realizing that they have come from a lineage of thought that is entirely culturally contingent, is responding to problems that existed before them, is trying to reconcile reason and faith. These assumptions aren't natural or objective.
No.
They're philosophical.
Yeah.
And if you want to understand the world, you got to understand the philosophy.
100%. It's almost kind of Cartesian.
Yeah.
He has, how he talks about, well, we can look at the sun and get an idea of it through senses, but we have a reasoned idea of it that is more accurate.
Yeah, exactly.
Almost in the same way. Or people go about their lives with these sensory ideas of how people, how society, how reality is based on their just kind of base experiences of it. But upon a bit more reflection, upon a bit more investigation, upon a bit more interrogation, we find out, well, there's actually a different nature to it.
Yeah.
And it's the task of philosophy to identify that nature, or at least Western philosophy.
Yes. And the differences between Western philosophy and Eastern philosophy, that's a whole other episode.
We should definitely do a couple episodes on some Eastern philosophy.
Yeah, particularly my hobby horse, Confucianism. But look, to ease us out, I thought rather than just ending there, we might sort of briefly ask one another, other than Descartes, what else have you been reading lately or thinking about lately?
As for reading, I've been reading this book, Mason and Dixon, by Thomas Pynchon, who's this massive figure in American literature. He's probably the biggest figure in literary postmodernism. And well, I've never really been all that much of like a literary guy, but I just listened to a podcast by a guy who really likes Pynchon, and he very thoroughly made the case for giving him a read. And I read what's considered his magnum opus, Gravity's Rainbow, and that was like the hardest thing I ever read. Like I was sweating the whole time just through the mental effort, and I didn't understand half of it, and I had to look at annotations like 3 times every single page to look up what he was referencing. But I don't know, like it was just a great piece of literature, and I wanted to keep going forward with some of his work.
So it was worth the effort.
Definitely worth the effort. So yeah, if you want some hard fiction to read, but hard fiction that is incredibly valuable, give Thomas Pynchon a go. As for what else I've been reading, I've been on and off reading a book by Eric Hobsbawm, which is this British Marxist historian. The Age of Revolution, 1789 to 1848, I think, where he it's part of his series. It's the first book in his series where he gives a history of how the modern Western world came to be. And in the Age of Revolution, he kind of just links it to 2 things. The French Revolution, which is the political revolution, like we were talking about, those ideas of liberalism, and the British Industrial Revolution, which kind of changed the economic basis of our society. And I honestly, I've taken a pause on that to read Meditations, and the week before to look over a bit of Charles Taylor again. So I need to get back into that. That's not too fresh in my mind. But yeah, that's all that's been going on with me. How about yourself?
Nice. Yeah, I've been reading a bit of fiction as well, which is somewhat new for me. I've been making a conscious effort to read fiction again.
Yeah, you're really not a fiction fella.
Well, I was when I was younger, and then I just sort of fell out of it. And then when I really started reading again properly was in university.
Yeah.
So by definition, it was just mostly nonfiction.
Mm.
But I've been reading the Three Body Problem trilogy by Cixin Liu.
I've heard it's very good.
It's really, really good. It's not perfect, but I would definitely recommend it to any sci-fi fan, and it's astonishing because it's translated from Chinese, and it's, I think, the first work of Chinese science fiction to be translated into English.
Mm.
And it's just great because it has so many references that are unique Chinese cultural references.
Mm.
And it's a really educational experience, but the imaginative scope of the book is just amazing. Like, the idea is so intriguing. And I've read the first 2 books of the trilogy. I'm yet to start the third.
Well, what is the idea?
Well, the idea is that basically there's this alien race called the Trisolarans. And they're called the Trisolarans, being 3, solar meaning sun, obviously. They come from this planet that orbits 3 suns. And because it's caught between these 3 celestial bodies, the climate of that planet is highly unstable. And so their civilization keeps having these fits and starts. They can't have any sort of stable period, which is actually an allusion to this idea from Chinese history, that Chinese history is full of periods of stability. And then the dynasty collapses and you get instability. So again, that's a reference to the way the Chinese understand history, or their own history. So that's really interesting. But they discover Earth, and I won't say how because that's integral to the first book. They discover Earth, and they go, wow, Earth, like, it's got this incredibly stable climate for now, knock on wood. And so they decide to invade. But it's going to take them 400 years to get to Earth, even though they're 4 light years away, because they can only travel about 20% the speed of light. So humanity has 400 years to prepare for this invasion, and it really explores how Earth society responds to knowing that they've got this existential threat that won't happen in your own lifetime, won't happen in your kid's lifetime, but it's going to happen.
Sounds familiar.
Does sound eerily familiar. And what is the psychology? You know, how do you respond to that? It's a really, really interesting book. But between finishing the second one and starting the third one, I started reading some other short stories by Ted Chiang, who's an Chinese-American sci-fi writer.
Yeah, didn't he write the story that the movie Arrival was based on?
He did. And the story that Arrival is based on is called Story of Your Life, and it's very, very good.
Arrival is much catchier.
Arrival is much catchier. The book itself doesn't really go that much into the aliens. It's more sort of about how their language... Well, people may have not seen the film.
Yeah.
But I'll just say that it's a really good read. And there's other one called Hell is the Absence of God, where he talks about this world where people know God exists because there are frequently angels who come down from Earth and perform miracles. And when people die... bystanders see whether their soul ascends to heaven or ascends to hell. And it's a really interesting book, a really interesting story, because he says that religion depends on faith. You know, we don't have evidence of God's existence. It depends on faith. So what would religion look like if we actually did have evidence?
Yeah.
How would that change how religion works? Very, very interesting. Very, very interesting read.
No, that sounds really good. I need to get into sci-fi a bit more, because there's always so... I feel like it's the genre of fiction with the greatest scope for sort of like imaginative thinking.
Yeah.
You know, it gives you the most space to toss about crazy ideas and see how they land.
You know, and it can be done very well or it can be done very poorly. You can use the sort of science fiction part of it to just construct these plot devices that resolve stories.
Yeah, it can definitely be done in a very lazy and also often very corny way.
Yeah.
But when sci-fi hits, it really hits.
It really hits. Like, if it's a good sci-fi writer and they're using the science not just to get out of having done an overly complicated plot line, then it's fantastic. But look, we're going to unfortunately go on what I think is a 3-week hiatus from the podcast.
Yeah, I'm going to be on placements for my teaching degree for the next 3 weeks. So I'm not going to really have all too much time to record. But I think we'll get reading on a text in that time. So at the end of that 3 weeks, probably in a month's time, we should have a new episode for you.
Absolutely. And if you have any questions or feedback or text that you would like to see covered at some point in time,
please give suggestions.
You can reach out on Instagram or email, which will both be in the podcast description.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.